Good morning and welcome to this video on literary theory. Today we're going to be looking at feminism, and this video might be particularly useful to you, especially if you've just finished your GCSEs and you want to start reading over the summer and getting ready for your A-level in English literature, or if you've already started your A-level as well and you want to think a little bit more deeply about some of the texts. There's lots of reading recommendations in here as well, and I would suggest that you go away and read as many of the novels as I mentioned as you can to get a really good idea of what I mean by the different interpretations that I'm going to be discussing. So first of all, what is feminist literary theory? Well, feminist critics explore the struggles women have faced in society and how these are represented, explored, challenged or redressed in literature. And by redressed I mean that the balance is given back, or justice might be done. And this is closely linked to understanding social, economic, psychological and political context as well as they relate to women in society. Feminism is based on the fundamental idea that societies around the world have been, or remain, male-centred, and that this needs to be challenged to achieve a level of equality. And this male dominance has been reflected in literature, leading critics to pose questions about texts such as, does Shakespeare present Lady Macbeth as an example of proto-feminism, so an early form of feminism, or does her death at the end of the play reveal the inevitable consequences for women who try to claim power in a patriarchal society? So on the one hand, in Act 1 and 2, we might be very impressed by Lady Macbeth's determination, the fact that she's very vocal, she's prepared to speak up and state her mind, even though she's talking about murder. On the other hand, we might look at her guilt, her remorse, her washing of the hands at the end of the play as an indication that she can't handle the situation that she's chosen to put herself within. So there's lots and lots of debates about whether Macbeth is a feminist play or whether actually in the play Shakespeare shows that women can't survive in this patriarchal world. And it's interesting to note that both female characters in the play do die by the end of it. We could also, looking a little bit further forward in history, ask ourselves, did Jane Austen's female heroines achieve a type of equality with their husbands? Or do they simply compromise and find a facade of contentment in their place within the system of the day? So I've recently been to see Emma at the cinema before the whole coronavirus outbreak, saw the new production of Emma in the cinema, and at the end of Emma, a woman who's very vocal, who's very independent, who's very determined, decides that she's going to marry Mr. Knightley, the person that she's in love with. And whilst that marriage seems to be right within the world of the play, actually, in order to achieve it, Emma has to make compromises and she has to be less vocal in her opinions. And whilst that might be morally the right thing to do, you know, her opinions have been quite offensive to other people earlier in the text, the fact that she has to censor her language and censor herself in order to achieve that marriage could raise questions about whether actually she's compromising, giving in to the patriarchy. A little bit further forward again in time, we could look at Charlotte Bronte and consider how Charlotte Bronte shows the psychological impact of the restrictions placed on women. We could also ask ourselves, why are so many of Dickens' female heroines given such marginal roles in which they are proved to be ultimately weak and in need of support from their male counterparts? And there's a whole host of novels you could look at here, and Bleak House is one that I'm particularly fond of, and we have a very strong female voice in that from the character of Esther Summerson. But ultimately, she needs to marry the man that she's in love with in order to secure her independence and in order to give herself a sense of resolution but also achievement at the end of the novel. Forward in time again into the 20th century, and a writer who I suppose at the time was hailed as being very liberal in terms of his opinions and representations of women, we could ask, are D.H. Lawrence's supposedly liberal representations of women actually repressive in the focus on female sexuality? You know, how accurate is D.H. Lawrence's representation of women? And feminist critics may seek to expose and critique the linguistic oppression that takes place in some of these texts, and they would also critique what this represents about how women are treated in wider society. They may also celebrate how some writers have successfully given women a voice in their work. Now, there's 4 waves of feminist literary theory, which we're going to look at now and break down a little bit. The first wave is from the 19th and the early to mid 20th centuries, and this was very much focused on securing votes, on property rights and equality for women. So you'll be very familiar with the work of the suffragettes and so on. And one theorist you might think of is Mary Wollstonecraft, who was the mother of Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. The second wave of feminism is based around the 1960s up until about the 1980s, and this is focused on exploring women's rights in the workplace and also family rights, which includes reproductive rights. In terms of literature, critics increasingly considered how language has been used as a means of maintaining male dominance. They were very interested in expanding the literary canon as well. And so theorists here might include Simone de Beauvoir, Gilbert and Goodbar, who wrote a very influential book called The Mad Woman in the Attic, which we'll come back to later in this series. And a lot of the way we interpret literary texts in school at the minute is very much based around the influence of second wave feminism. Third wave feminism started in about the 1990s. It's much more focused on exploring the individuality of individual women. So third wave feminists often look back at second wave feminists and critique the fact that they talked about women as a homogenous group, as being all of the same, and all women are subject to the same kind of patriarchal control structures and so on. And what third wave feminists do is often look at the impact of different contexts. So, for example, they might link feminism more closely to post-colonialism, to queer theory, to Marxism, and look at the particularities of how those contexts have changed what's happened to the woman that they're writing about. There's also a growing level of interest in masculinity, so that understanding that patriarchal assumptions didn't just cause women to be repressed, but also cause men to be incorrectly stereotyped and repressed as well. Now, at the minute, we're probably arguably in the fourth wave of feminism, which has started in the 2010s, and it very much aims at empowering women, particularly online. It's linked to the Me Too movement and to achieving justice for sexual harassment. How this is going to play out in terms of literary theory specifically, I'm not sure yet, but I'm sure we'll discover over the coming years. There are some key terms that you need to be aware of if you're going to write from a feminist perspective. So the most important one, you'll have done this all the way since year 7, is patriarchy, which is a means of organising society in which men, so the father or the husband, hold power and authority. Stereotyping, again, will be another very familiar term to you, and this is a fixed idea of how people should behave, depending on how society categorises them. So, for example, men are supposed to be strong and brave and, in control and dominant and intelligent and all of that, whereas women are often more physically weak. So these are stereotypes that we know to be incorrect, but they retain a huge amount of power even in our society, particularly if you look at the advertising that's all around us. The term social contract is very important, and this is the idea that an idea that has been created by society and is believed by many in society. So, for example, the qualities of a good woman or the definition of masculinity. So stereotypes themselves are a social construct. They're not real, they're not based on truth. Ideology is a key term, and that means a set of belief or values often characteristic of a particular group. So the ideology of male dominance, for example. The literary canon is something I'm going to come back to in a later video because it's a very complex discussion to have, and it means essentially a collection of literary texts which have been judged to have had a significant impact on Western culture. So Shakespeare, for example, is the foundation of the literary canon that we study in school. And you might want to ask yourself, who has judged these texts to have had this impact? Well, it's probably men, because the people who have been deciding what students are going to study at school, at university and so on, what people need to read, what's going to be in libraries, has historically been men, because it's been men who have had those positions of power, who've had those jobs and the education to be in a place to decide about curriculums and so on. Obviously, more recently, this has changed with women getting a higher level of education and taking these positions of power themselves. But historically, those judgments were traditionally made by men. And what does it mean by having had a significant impact on Western culture? Well, what is that impact, and how do you define it? How do you categorise it? And who is excluded from this list, and why have they been excluded? Have they been excluded because they've been judged not to be good enough? And what does it mean not to be a good enough writer? Does that mean that they're not like Shakespeare? That they don't write in the same way? So there's a whole host of questions that we can ask about the literary canon. And traditionally, what feminists would say is that women have been excluded from the literary canon. If you look at the list of authors that we study at school and universities, so many of them fall into the category of dead white men. And can we change this? Should we change this? And so on. So many questions to ask there. So that's for another video. I've got a list of adjectives here, which are words that would be really useful to you to describe the treatment of women within a patriarchal society. Marginalised, as I talked about in the video on post-colonialism, means to be relegated to the edge of society and culture. You might also talk about the distribution of power, so how authority is organised within a society and who holds that authority. Stereotypes of women, then, as I've mentioned, are very dominant within our society, and feminist critics often examine and challenge stereotypical representation of women in literature, and sometimes you might use the term archetypes to talk about those representations. So we have the Madonna figure. So, for example, Lady Macduff in Macbeth. She's absolutely perfect. She's loyal to her husband. She's chaste. She's a mother figure. And she just oozes perfection, I suppose, in the text. Now, that's a really unrealistic character to have. We could also talk about the self-sacrificing angel. So Esther Summerson in Bleak House, for example, helps everybody else before herself, puts everyone else's needs first, and she's so absolutely perfect, it's almost sickening a little bit in the text. We could talk about the immoral seductress. So often in productions of Macbeth, Lady Macbeth is presented as seducing Macbeth into agreeing with her point of view. Bertha in Jane Eyre as well is presented as being kind of worrying because she's an over-sexualised character. That seems to be part of her madness in the text, and that's one of the reasons why Rochester has locked her up, because there's something, inverted commas, wrong with her because of that. The bitter shrew is quite a dominant character as well. So this is someone who's quite nagging, who always wants to kind of have their say in things. So if we were talking about men, you might talk about, someone who's determined, someone who wants to have a voice in a situation. Whereas if a woman wants to say, speak their mind or so on, they can often be described as this very kind of bitter shrew character. So, for example, Katharina in The Taming of the Shrew, or Emilia at the start of Othello would also be described as being a shrew. We have the damsel in distress as well. So looking back at some Gothic texts, Emily in The Mysteries of Udolpho is very much in this stereotype. We've got Ada Clare in Bleak House. We've got the maid in Jekyll and Hyde who faints at the first sign of blood and who can't deal with the situation. And feminist literary theory argues that these depictions of women are social constructions which either intentionally or, more worryingly, unintentionally reinforce patriarchal power structures. So by presenting women in this way, it suggests that they're not intelligent enough, they're not capable enough, that they don't have the mental capacity to be able to make the same kind of decisions or to be able to be in control of a situation in the same way as men are. And what a lot of feminists and feminist critics want to do is to challenge these structures and achieve equality. And so therefore they seek to expose these stereotypes as being deeply flawed and give women a voice. Now, I've put on the screen there real women, and that of course is a whole debatable subject, what that means. But if we're talking about kind of second wave feminism here, what they seem to think was that there's an idea of femininity which needs to be given a voice, which needs to be articulated. Let's look at some of the texts then in which second wave feminists would say that this has happened. And from the start of the 19th century, we see an increase in both male and female authors striving to write a more accurate version of femininity and female experience. However, because we've all been raised with culturally inscribed assumptions of gender and gender roles, it can be really difficult to rid ourselves of these and to truly articulate female experience. And also that word female experience is so There's an idea of homogeneity there as well, the idea that there's only one kind of experience of being a woman that needs to be articulated. And so this is very much a second wave feminism idea, which third wave feminists would seek to complicate and say, actually, there's not just one experience, there's a whole spectrum of experiences that we need to talk about here. So critics might look at Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights from 1847. It was originally published under the male pseudonym Ellis Bell, which tells us something in itself about how Emily Bronte thought that she would be received by the public if she presented herself as being a female author. And Wuthering Heights articulates women's frustration at their limited opportunities in life. So we see Catherine, who's kind of railing, who's striving against the limitations that are placed on her. And it shows the disastrous results of following a stereotypical pattern. So Isabella, for example, gets married, has a child, and it all ends disastrously. Don't want to give away the ending too much, though. Charlotte Bronte, Emily's sister, published Jane Eyre in the same year, 1847, again using a male pseudonym, Currer Bell. Now, unlike Wuthering Heights, Jane Eyre seems to suggest a slightly more positive and more optimistic approach to this discussion about women's power. And it suggests that it's possible for women to be intelligent, independent, and to achieve equality in a romantic relationship. Although that is complicated by the ending of the novel. I'm not going to give away the ending, so have a read and let me know what you think about the ending of Jane Eyre. Moving forward in time, we could look at Kate Chopin's novella The Awakening from 1899. Now, this was at the cusp of the new century. It was before the suffragettes became a kind of dominant force in British politics, and it's actually very ahead of its time. And whereas many earlier novels reflected on women gaining equal financial and intellectual independence, and that's very much the theme of Jane Eyre, this novella focuses on psychological and sexual liberation. However, the ending, again, I'm not going to tell you what happens, suggests a rather pessimistic outlook on whether this can be achieved. In the 20th century then, a really important writer, absolutely fabulous, is Virginia Woolf. Her novel Mrs. Dalloway from 1925 reflects on women's experience of mental illness, possibly as a result of their oppression, and also brings in this theme of bisexuality. So what does it mean if women don't conform to the expectation that they're going to marry a man? How does that play out? How does that impact a woman's psychological state? Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar from 1963 again explores the idea of women's intelligence, mental illness, and so on. And the final novel I'm listing here, there are many, many others that you could talk about, is Toni Morrison's novel Beloved from 1987. And the reason I picked this is that it links feminism with post-colonial themes as well. So the narrator of Beloved is a former slave who's been freed and who has to deal with the traumatic legacy of that slavery. So I've put those last few novels in there just to show that this female experience that second wave feminists often talk about is more complicated than there just being one perception of this, that there are so many other ways of looking at this as well. Right, what might a feminist interpretation look like then? Well, I've taken the example of Othello here by Shakespeare, and we could look at to what extent is Amelia presented as a proto-feminist figure in Othello. And on the screen I've put a speech that Amelia gives in Act 4, Scene 3. So she's talking to Desdemona, who we know is going to be murdered very shortly by her husband, by Othello, and Amelia is expressing her idea that actually women shouldn't just follow what their husbands do, and that women should have a little bit more freedom. And so she says, yes, a dozen, and as many to the vantage as would store the world they played for. But I do think it is their husbands' faults if wives do fall. Say they slack their duties and pour our treasures into foreign laps, or else break out in peevish jealousies, throwing restraint upon us. Or say they strike us, or scant our former having in despite. Why, we have goals, and though we have some grace, yet have we some revenge. So the first section of this speech blames the husband and the husband's infidelity and the impact that that has on the wife. So it is their husband's fault if wives do fall. So if a wife has an affair, it is because actually the husband's had an affair first. When it talks about the husbands pouring our treasures into foreign laps, it suggests here that they're giving some kind of payment or jewellery or presents or even just their love to another woman outside the marriage. It says they strike us, so domestic violence is an important theme in Othello, and it's interesting to compare this scene because Othello has struck Desdemona just previously to this scene here, and what Emilia is trying to say is that if men strike their wives, that kind of almost legitimizes or explains, justifies why the wife might look elsewhere for love. And then she says, let husbands know their wives have sense like them. They see and smell, and have their palates both for sweet and sour as husbands have. What is it they do when they change us for others? Is it sport? I think it is. And doth affection breed it? I think it doth. Is frailty that thus errs? It is so too. And have we not affections, desires for sport, and frailty as men have? Then let them use us well, else let them know the ills we do, their ills instruct us so. So where she's talking here, she says that it's not just men who maybe get bored of their wives and who want to have an affair. Actually, women have different tastes as well, and they might choose the man that they want to be with rather than just letting their father choose the marriage for them. She mentions that having an affair with someone else might be sport. It's evidence of human frailty, so the fact that someone might not be loyal to their spouse would be a frailty in that romantic relationship. And then she says that actually women have that too. Women want to have fun too. Women are just as frail as men are too. They make mistakes as well. And so she finishes this speech by saying, let them use us well. If men treat us well, then women will respond positively as well. So I suppose in this day and age it's not as radically feminist as we might hope for, but at the time, and given the context of the play, this would have been an incredibly feminist speech for Emilia to say on the stage. Now, Emilia and Desdemona are character foils throughout the play. In Act 2, Desdemona is confident, she's witty, she's determined, and she's very much in contrast to the shrew, Emilia, who's insulted by her husband and says little. Then in Acts 3 and 4, Emilia appears to be acting entirely to please Iago. She's under his power. She takes the handkerchief which Desdemona drops, she gives it to Iago, and she seems to be using this handkerchief as a way of securing his affections, of making sure that she's doing something for him, therefore he's going to return his love for her. But by the end of Act 4, Emilia is giving this speech that we've just looked at, an extraordinary speech about the equality of men and women, a speech which says, actually, all of us are just human and we all have human frailties. So one way of interpreting it would be to suggest that actually what Emilia is doing is challenging this idea of socially constructed differences, and actually just we're all part of humanity. And by this stage in the play, Desdemona is reduced to a fragile, weak victim of Othello's jealousy and violence, and the device of the character foil remains, but it's actually reversed, and Emilia comes out as the stronger figure in this scene. However, a feminist might question the power of Emilia's speech here, because her speech is actually given within the private space of the bedroom. So whilst all of the men and Desdemona at the start of the play give speeches in front of everybody, they give speeches in front of the Duke and Iago and Othello, in front of different soldiers and so on, different political figures, Emilia gives this speech to one person, a woman, within the bedroom. So this suggests that she doesn't yet have the confidence to speak her mind in the public political forum controlled by men. So her rebellion has limitations on it. Having said this, though, Emilia then refuses to be quiet in Act 5, Scene 2. She says, I am bound to speak, when Iago tells her basically, shut up, don't give the game away. So she's commanded to be silent by Iago, but this is a heroic moment for Emilia. She defies her husband, she denounces him in public, she reveals what he's done to Othello and Desdemona, and so here she really puts her feminist opinions into action. There's another caveat though. Her courage and her determination leads to her death as she's killed by Iago. Sorry for giving the ending of the play away. She's killed by Iago. So is Shakespeare saying that yes, women can have these opinions, but ultimately within a patriarchal society they are going to be silenced? And it's really interesting that Emilia's rebellion is one of using words, of using language to try and gain power over the situation, to try to control the situation. And that contrasts very much with the scene, Act 5, Scene 1, where the men try to use physical violence as well as language in order to control what's happening. So there are some questions that you might want to ask yourself if you're doing a feminist interpretation of a text. So firstly, how are women and their experience portrayed? What does this tell us about their experience of being marginalised? Whose voices are privileged in the narrative? Why do we hear these voices whilst others are silenced? What does this tell you about the writer's intentions and their perspective? So looking at this in relation to a text then, are women allowed to voice their own experience, or is this filtered through a male perspective or through male voices? So for example, in Wide Sargasso Sea, the character of Antoinette is allowed to speak and give her experience. However, in contrast, whilst Esther is the female first-person narrator of Bleak House, does it matter that the author is male? Does having a male author mean that that female voice is going to be negated in some way? You might look at the presentation of a woman's experience and whether it's authentic. Is such a thing even possible? Or does it have the hallmarks of stereotyping? So again, going back to the ending of Jane Eyre, does Jane really achieve equality, or does she compromise and accept a stereotypical female role as mother and carer? You might ask yourself, does the text explore and challenge power relations between men and women? So Sonnet 29 by Elizabeth Barrett Browning is an incredible poem, and it certainly does challenge power relations. However, at the end of the poem, she talks about being in her husband's shadow. So does that compromise a reading of the poem as a feminist text? And is the same true of Love's Philosophy by Shelley? Does that challenge power relations? Well, probably not, because Shelley, the speaker of the poem, seems to be positioning the woman in a very passive situation. You might also ask yourself, are women presented as being essentially different from men, or is this difference presented as a social construct? So Lady Macbeth, for example, is presented as being physically weaker than Macbeth. Lady Macduff, as well, is presented as being too weak to challenge her murders physically. But does Shakespeare show that this weakness is a result of social expectations, or does he show that this is a, inverted commas, natural part of being a woman? Are there any texts that you've read that actually challenge these, I suppose, biological assumption that these differences are biological, or do they reinforce them? Okay, thank you very much for listening. The next video on theory is going to be on Marxism, so watch this space for that.